Thank you. So, in more than one sense, I will not be able to respond to all of these pointed and helpful criticisms. Some of them I just don't know what to say about. And I'm indebted to Professor Morriston not just for stepping in at the last moment, but for delivering such terrific commentary. So let me focus on two critical points. First, Professor Morriston's rejection of my appeal to skeptical theism. And second, his criticism of the use to which I put the idea that God does not naturally share a decheological order with us. So on skeptical theism, in order to get focused on the question of whether God can naturally wrong us, I wanted to put to the side the claim that God could act wrongly with respect to us without wronging us. And my view is that because we have no basis, no adequate basis for assessing the reasons God had for ordering the destruction of the Jerichoites, we are in no position to make that claim. Professor Morriston argues that because Scripture tells us, in fact, what God's ends were and how they failed even to be achieved by the order, we must judge that, construed as a literal account of what God did and why God did it. God acted wrongly with respect to the Jerichoites, right? So the idea is that even if you dump all the stuff about decheological orders, you can still get enough from those texts, construed literally, to see that God is acting wrongly there. So it seems to me that we should distinguish between the sorts of ordinary reasons that we give one another in justifying our conduct and what Raz has called complete reasons, right? And a complete reason is a fact that includes everything, right, in it. It's a obtaining state of affairs that includes everything that's necessary to entail the choiceworthiness of the action for which it is a reason. Now, when we're justifying our conduct to one another, right, when we're trying to explain or trying to give good reasons for making one set of choices rather than another, or trying to just make intelligible the performance of one line of action rather than another, we don't trade in complete reasons, right? I mean, this is not something we do. It would take an awfully long time. It would be tedious. It would be repetitive because of the common understanding between us and our and the people that we're speaking to. There's no point in doing so. I don't trade in complete reasons for further on a further basis when I'm talking to my children and explaining why when my child wants to play and I'm spending all this time preparing dinner of a certain sort, I could make dinner by just grabbing the chicken nuggets if I was throwing them in the oven, right? But I'm trying to explain. I don't need to give sort of the full explanation of all the various goods that are involved in family meals and making this sort of meal rather than another, nutritional value, all that stuff, right? I don't trade in these sorts of reasons with beings not just my fellow sort of semi-mature adults, but with children who are unable to grasp complete reasons, that they can be given sort of some sort of dim view of the kind of reasons that are involved in my action or that justify my action. Now, but if we're trying to make explicit the justifications of our actions, right? We're not talking sort of what are the pragmatic bases for pragmatically, how do we proceed in giving reasons to one another? But when we're asking what actually justifies our actions, where it gives us good reason to go one way rather than another, it's complete reasons that do the job. Okay. Now, so having made that distinction, of course I allow, right, that Scripture reports God's reasons for giving the order, right, and that these involve the general wickedness of the Jerichoites and the tendency of the Israelites to get mixed up in this wickedness. But what should interest us, right, are the complete reasons, right? It's the complete reasons that what makes the order choice-worthy. And my point is that we don't have much of a clue about what those complete reasons will look like when they're fully spelled out, okay? We know that the kinds of goods that are available to plants sort of pale in significance to the kinds of goods that are available to animals, to lower animals, non-human animals. These sorts of goods pale in comparison to the sorts of goods that are available to human animals. It seems highly plausible that the kind of goods that are knowable by God, right, and can be pursued by God, were the kinds of reasons that we wouldn't be able to grasp and God wouldn't be able to explain to us in any sort of detail. But perhaps the wickedness of the Jerichoites, right, is sufficient to put us on the right track to seeing what God has in mind. So any line of reasoning, I think this is something that Peter Van Enwagen pointed out, any line of reasoning that explicitly or implicitly makes use of the counterfactual, if I were to command the destruction of the Jerichoites, what would my reasons be, is a very bad way, I think, of figuring out God's reasons. Now, as to the insufficiency of the order to bring about the end sought, okay, so Professor Morriston notices that it didn't do a very good job, God's given the order didn't do a very good job in realizing the end that God obviously had in commanding the destruction of the Jerichoites. Professor Morriston assumes, I don't I don't understand the criticism otherwise. Perhaps we could talk more about this during discussion. That God's end in giving the command, right? God's end was the total non-existence of the Jerichoites. Now, here's the thing. It does not follow from God's giving the command, exterminate the Jerichoites, that God's end, that there be no Jerichoites, okay? That we can give commands that are of that form, that don't, in which the commander, though perfectly sincere, right, non-defective in any way, non-defective in the ways relevant to giving commands, doesn't intend the end state of the command being fully, the end state that the command is fully successfully carried out. Right. So it's not obvious to me that from the mere fact that God is very explicit that what the command is, the objective by which the Israelites are to be guided is the extermination of the Jerichoites, that it follows that that's what was God's end in giving the command. Even if the total elimination of the Jerichoites were the favored outcome, right, that it was not fully realized would show nothing toward the failure of justification of the command, without a further argument that for this end to be justified, it would have to be fully realized. I mean, after all, God's giving us all sorts of commands about what counts as good behavior. They're not unjustified just because there's still a lot of bad behavior going around, right? And I assume that the fact that we more closely approximate or are able to meet more closely approximate ideals of good behavior give some justification over that command. And what's more, Morriston's objection would have to assume that all of God's reasons for giving the command involve end states to be brought about by the Israelites' attempt to obey the command. But a little reflection makes clear, I think, that there are justifying reasons for the mundane commands that we give that go beyond the end states to be realized through obedience. Okay, so again, if we focus entirely on what the Israelites were bringing about through obeying the command, we ignore the fact there might be reasons for giving the command that are not just goods to be or ends to be realized through the Israelites' compliance. Okay, now, so on God and the decalogical order, right? So Professor Morriston rightly notes that I should say more and say it more plausibly about the way that divine action can be subject to assessment within the human decalogical order. There are numerous criticisms here, so let me try to sort of resketch the big picture in a way that makes pretty clear how I would address them. It's a good thing to give these papers out loud. Professor Curley was noting this earlier because I finally realized exactly I don't think this will at all eliminate the difference between us, but I think it'll be clear about what my view is, which I badly expressed at one crucial line in the paper. So what I want to say is that the history suggested is the history of the relationship between God and human beings is one in which God entered sporadically and for his own good purposes into cooperative endeavors with individual humans and groups of humans. I want to say that within those transactions, right, it is coherent to assess God's actions in terms of our decalogical order, right? It's faithful and unfaithful, or faithful or unfaithful, and the answer is always faithful. I would not say, then, that God's entering into such a cooperative enterprise with the Israelites means that God is subject to assessment in terms of human justice beyond the Israelites, or that God's entering into some relationship with some human being means that anybody who's in any way related to those human beings, God somehow has mixed up with them as well. So that's why I think that while God owed the Israelites something, he didn't owe the Jerichoites anything. I do think, though, and this is where I formulated my view in a way that's bad. I said the only way for God to enter is cooperatively, and that's not right. That's not the view that I wanted to do. I do think that we're now tied to God in a normative order for a different reason. The normal reason that we're tied to other people in a normative order by sharing our common human nature, right? So I do think that we are now tied to God in our normative order for a different reason, right? And one that extends to all human beings, right? That God has become incarnate as a human, and since it is a sufficient condition to be part of the human decalogical order to bear a human nature, God is now fully bound to us by ties of justice, human justice. And this is, I would say, one more way in which God humbled himself to share in our humanity. Thank you.
I will remind you of some of the norms of our conversational order, in particular that follow-up questions are not encouraged.
Pretty much if you don't have the microphone, you shouldn't be talking.
Yes, if you don't have the microphone, you shouldn't be talking. The microphone will be given to people as I recognize them. I believe Professor Curley, Professor Weithman, the gentleman there, and this gentleman and this gentleman so far.
And that gentleman.
Who's first?
Wide angle, he says. He wanted to be on the list.
You would like to be on the list? Okay, yes.
That's not my comment.